A number of public bodies have access to your information, but have you given them consent? Well, what does POPI have to say? This is Stuff Employers Should Know.
Welcome to Stuff Employers Should Know, proudly brought to you by LabourNet, management's ultimate HR solution.
Hey, and welcome to the podcast. It's Yaslakit Ismail, your sound producer and host for the day. Unfortunately, Barry Gordon-Davis couldn't join us for today's show. And we have, formerly known as friend of the show, and now promoted to savior of the show, Samantha Walker, who will be discussing POPI and Public Bodies with an information compliance consultant of hers. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us and, of course, helping us get this episode out today.
So today's topic that we're going to be looking at is POPI and public bodies, and really how do they differentiate in their needs and their obligations to private bodies, and what do they need to look out for specifically themselves? To discuss this topic with me today, I have one of my information compliant consultants.
I'm Chanel Sprieman. Thank you so much for having me today, Sam.
Thank you for being here and discussing this topic with us. From what I understand, you've just written an article on this.
Yes, I have. I was actually dealing with a public body. So most of the clients that we have are private bodies. So when dealing with a public body, I found that, I'd always have to be looking at different ways to deal with them and figuring out what was going on. So I just decided then to just write an article about it and just really get into how they should operate with regards to POPI.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned private and public bodies. Who are they? What are the differences there?
So in the most basic sense, your private bodies would be any private companies. It would also include your smaller NPOs. And your public bodies are then basically all of your government institutions. This would also extend to, like, for example, the judiciary, municipalities, your SAPs. So basically anybody who pretty much operates within the ambit of an act or is just employed by the state.
Okay, so private bodies include all of our PTY limiteds, our closed corporations, and then our public bodies include any of our governmental departments, really.
Yes,
okay, perfect.
Correct.
How does the Act define these to be different?
Well, it doesn't actually. So basically within the Act, we're always dealing with what we call the responsible party. So that was the point of departure for me actually when doing the research. So if you look at the Act, when the Act defines a responsible party, they actually refer to a public or private body. So in that sense, we understand that the public bodies are already included in the Act from the definition section already.
Okay, so they can't just get away and ignore POPI. POPI is going to be applicable to them as well.
Yes.
Now, in terms of a public body, we've mentioned now that sometimes they have to operate differently in terms of POPI. What are really their risks that a public body needs to look out for?
The main risks that the public bodies would need to look out for is that, so basically public bodies are custodians of large pieces of information. I mean, they probably have our most sensitive information. I mean, from birth, Home Affairs has your ID numbers. They issue your ID numbers down to the Department of Labor. So their main risk would just be, obviously, the information being, distributed and accessed by unauthorized individuals. So in that sense, they are placed under quite a lot of obligation to ensure that they do protect the information that they have. So the main risk is just that they have just such large pieces of information that they definitely need to manage it correctly.
No, definitely. If I think about every government body that has my personal information and what type of information they have, it's all very sensitive information. So what are their obligations to really protect it or process it? Do they have carte blanche with my information because they're a public body? How does that really differ to the private bodies we've spoken about on the show before?
So the one thing that we always have to keep in mind is that POPI is a type of act that places obligations on an individual, yes, but you don't want to impede what that individual's function is. So you still want them to be able to operate and still do what they need to do in terms of what their objectives are.
It's almost a balancing of rights.
Yes, so we need to always balance the rights to privacy and then also just understand that specific body has a function. So with the public bodies, their functions are usually within the public interest. So I think that this could usually be seen as something that you could use as a justification. But like I said, I mean, when you're carrying you have such large pieces of information, you definitely need to ensure that you're protecting it. So the Act, when we look in the Act, there's always reference to public bodies with a lot of exclusions, which is also a little bit concerning. I mean,
when you say exclusions, they don't have to comply with an obligation in terms of POPI. They're given freedom from that.
Yes. So basically, the Act a lot of times would outline certain obligations on a party and then would then put them in exemptions or exclusions. So you would have to, be strictly adhering to a specific requirement, and then it would always just say then unless performing a public duty or as part of a public body. So that would then only refer usually to that specific requirement, like, for example, usually getting consent or something like that. But the public bodies then are still under obligations with regards to the main conditions of POPI, because we understand that POPI doesn't only operate with regards to your security safeguards. I mean, processing entails the way that you're dealing with the information, the actual information quality as well. So they do need to comply with some of the obligations that are placed on everybody based on the 8 conditions.
Okay, so it's not like our public bodies or our governmental bodies just can do with our information whatever they want to. They have to still comply with the 8 main conditions, just like the private bodies. There would just be a few exemptions here and there where they are excused from having to perform that obligation because they've got a public duty to perform. Would that be correct? Awesome.
Correct.
Now, does a public body always need my consent to process my information? I know we've discussed justifications previously on the show. Can they operate without that consent, or can they move with the justification?
So usually they don't need consent. That's pretty much one of the main, I would say, obligations that they don't have to comply with. Usually a public body doesn't really need consent. And I know that can be concerning for everybody, especially in the climate that we are dealing with, where usually a private body, we understand POPI and we are now in that mindset of getting consent. And then a public body comes along. I know, like with the Department of Labor, I've had clients where they are now a little bit weary of them, getting information without consent. So their main requirement that they don't have to comply with is the consent requirement. And if I could just go into Section 38. So in Section 38, that's like the most glaringly obvious exemptions that the public bodies have. So basically in Section 38, it says that you can do away with the following requirements if you're processing information while executing a relevant function. So you won't need to get consent. You won't need to collect the personal information directly from the data subject. And that requirement where further processing needs to comply with the original purpose, that's completely done away with. And you don't need to notify the data subject if you have their information. So those are quite big requirements that
those
are usually
almost our largest obligations that we generally have to comply with.
So according to Section 38, that can be done away with if you're performing a relevant function. And a relevant function then would be defined as any function of a public body. So we see that they do have quite a bit of carte blanche in terms of consent and collecting and how they collect the information.
So now at the same time, while we don't necessarily need to go out and get this express consent if we're a public body, there is parameters to that, I'm sure. They can't just take our information and use it for any purpose or sell our information or give it away.
Yeah.
Is there any parameters put on that you don't need consent?
So there would be instances where when we look at now, because like I mentioned earlier, POPI is about balancing a lot of rights. So the data subjects do have rights. So the data subjects can also withdraw consent from a public body, but then that would then be based on the assumption that the public body actually did request the consent in the beginning. But also, I think they would also be allowed to withdraw consent if it doesn't prejudice or like mess with the lawful, I guess, undertaking or activity that the public body is trying to perform. But those are the only instances that I've found where the data subject is a little bit empowered in terms of the consent that they can give or withdraw from public bodies.
100%. And I think if we can take that even further, that even in POPI, when you have consent, you need to be processing for a specific purpose. Mm-hmm. And even if they don't need consent, the public body would still need to be processing for that specific purpose. So unless it's aligned with the purposes of the governmental body or public body, they don't necessarily have free carte blanche here. It is restricted, so we don't have to panic that our information is now just going to be done with whatever they want to.
Yes, no, definitely. Because we also, if we can maybe just look at, so we've seen in Section 38, yes, there's a lot of exemptions that apply to public bodies, but in terms of the 8 conditions, they would still be held to comply with those 8 conditions. So, for example, like the first one, accountability. Government bodies should identify themselves to whoever information they're processing, and they should also identify the risks. That's how you know that you're complying with, for example, the first condition. And we have briefly kind of mentioned it. They should obviously be collecting information only that's required. And obviously for them, it would be for a lawful purpose. So that requirement would be easy to comply with. And the minimality aspect of it would also be easy to comply with because they usually operate within a defined scope. So, if SARS is collecting your information, it's only for tax-related purposes. If the Department of Home Affairs has it, it's only for that specific department. So at least we know that requirement in terms of POPI would be complied with. And then that also then leads us to or they would then also be able to comply with the condition of purpose specific or being purpose specific, let me say. So we know that, for example, SARS is only going to process our information for tax related things that they do. Information quality, this one could be a little bit difficult for them to comply with just because of, obviously some government bodies are still transitioning, some have old information. So basically with information quality, they need to have information that's complete, it needs to be accurate, it needs to be up to date. So that is probably an undertaking that they would have to really put a lot of intention behind and ensure that the information quality that they are collecting is up to standard. And I imagine also as they're now trying to move into a digital age, that also then further pushes them to be able to do that.
I'm sure with just the mass amount of personal information they collect, if you think every person in South Africa will touch a government organization at some point, to ensure that data is all accurate, I'm sure is going to be
a massive
very large undertaking that is going to take some time to actually comply with. Now, you mentioned earlier the Department of Labour. And how they can sort of collect information. I think we've discussed a lot about what are the obligations. Maybe we can take you through an example with the Department of Labour as to how it would really work, because I think many of our clients and many of the listeners have gone through a Labour Department audit. Can the Labour Department just come in and ask for information? They are a public body. We've just discussed they don't need consent. So how does this really function when that public body is now interacting with a private body?
The Department of Labour would be an instance where they really have quite a bit of carte blanche in terms of the information that they process, and it then works hand in hand because you need them to be able to ensure that you're complying and give them information, and then they obviously need to perform their function. So my advice in that instance would be, we can't really run away from the fact that they are a public body and thus don't necessarily need consent. But I think that we can, as private bodies, place them under an obligation to ensure that they are at least complying with the security safeguards aspect of POPI. Yes, you don't have to you're not getting the consent from the employees, but maybe, depending on who you speak to, just ensure that, when you're sending emails, try to maybe encrypt the documents. We kind of have to, I guess, force them into what the private bodies are doing in terms of POPI, because obviously they are taking it quite seriously. And I think that, even if it is in small instances, you find that they would then start to understand that, okay, this private body clearly has a bit of a pull, and we should then comply with, sending maybe documents that are, encrypted, or just ensuring that they receive documents on the other side properly, sending, putting confidential, all of those security safeguards that people are undertaking in terms of what they want to do with POPI. I think that they shouldn't now exempt public bodies as well themselves. That would be the only thing, I think, at this point, until they fully get on board as well, that could at least assist us in terms of how we deal with them, and not feeling too disempowered ourselves. No,
completely agree. I think it's very important for our private bodies to note that if a public body has a public duty to perform, and it requires personal information from that private body cannot say no. There's a legal obligation. So, we have to hand over our employee information. Yesterday, I saw a notice from the Department of Labour where someone had previously refused to give that information, and now they had an order requiring them to hand over their full financials. So this does get worse if we don't comply with these public bodies. But now public bodies, as we've mentioned, has all this personal information. I'm sure they are the target of many a cyber attack.
No, they are definitely the most, I guess, recent and a relevant example is COJ. So in 2019, there was a hacker group, Shadow Kill Hackers. It was like a movie because they were like sending out tweets and everything. It was quite wild. They had then advised COJ that they had now hacked into their systems, and they actually wanted Bitcoin. They're demanding Bitcoin.
I believe it was 4 Bitcoin.
4 Bitcoins. They wanted 4 Bitcoins, and if they didn't get that, then they threatened to upload all the data onto the internet. They were like literally terrorizing them. There was tweets and everything. So COJ then, they just shut down their systems. I remember actually, I think there was a matter that we were dealing with COJ, and you can't get anything from them because I can't remember how long it was. It was definitely at least a couple of weeks where their systems were completely down. And you can imagine now this was before July 2021. So basically with regards to POPI, yes, I think there was definitely discussions around it. But I don't think the information regulator got involved. It was
a bit before their time.
Yes, yeah. So there have been instances where people are targeting municipalities because of the fact that they do have large pieces of information with them. And last year, Joburg Water, I don't know.
Joburg also went under.
Yeah. So they actually sent out an email to all of their service providers. So basically what was happening was that with the tendering process, people would then submit their tenders and then get these fake letters from Joburg Water advising that they had been appointed. Joburg Water then had to issue out a statement just to advise everybody who had perhaps tendered within that year that, look, you are perhaps getting some information that you've been awarded tenders, and that's not the case. So people had gotten into the Joburg water systems. They were using their letterhead. They had the exact schedule of like the rates that would have been required and attached. So I know these
cyber attacks can do a lot of damage.
Yes, they can. They definitely can. I imagine if you now have been tendered and now you're going to start the process and Joburg Water doesn't even know about you, or if you think about with COJ, how much information, I mean, Johannesburg is very populated. They have tons of information that dates back years. So having that out would definitely have put them at risk.
I know even the Department of Justice was hacked. Their emails were hacked and held for ransom as well. That really affected us in the legal space.
Yes.
Because none of the judges or clerks of the court could actually access their emails.
I remember that, yeah.
And I was actually going to court the next day when they were hacked. And all of a sudden I got an email from the judge off his Gmail account. That was very confusing. For all of us, really, it was happening to all of us because the courts needed to operate. So that's what they did. But now using your personal email address for work-related
it doesn't look good.
Is a huge other risk as well.
Yeah.
So these risks are important, and I think we need to take note of them. Public bodies definitely need to take note of them. But public bodies are not the only ones being affected by this. Private bodies, too, are hacked all the time. Most recently yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday Dis-Chem, there was news that Dis-Chem systems had been hacked. Apparently around 3.7 million Dis-Chem customers' information was out. So names, surnames, email addresses, cell phone numbers. Dis-Chem has come a little bit under fire. Well, that was with regards to other stuff, but now there's a hack. There was also that TransUnion one at the beginning of the year as well. So these things are really happening. And I mean, we think that, okay, it's just a name, it's just an email address or cell phone number, but, I wouldn't want that out there. It still definitely is personal information. We really don't know where this is going. We don't know who's accessing it. So we really do need to take care. I mean, if a big organization like Dis-Chem, who should, have safeguards in place can be at risk, then definitely public bodies should not just be sitting back. They probably do have more resources even that the Dis-Chem does to access, definitely getting safeguards in place. So they should definitely not be taking a back seat.
100%. So I think we can really wrap this chat up by saying, yes, you may have some exemptions as a public body, but at the same time, you have great risks because you're in the public face and you do hold sensitive information. Even if I look, the spokesperson for the information regulator said back in, I believe it was around the 21st of December last year, that they had 139 reported breaches already. And if you look, we're a couple of months down the line. If you think about what's been in the news, it's been a lot more. So while you have exemptions, you really need to consider those security requirements, particularly for public bodies. I think that's really an area they should focus.
No, I definitely agree. I think that they do definitely, just generally, public bodies feel always exempt from a lot of legislation. But yeah, no, they definitely need to take it seriously. And we, I think, can also ensure that we are holding them accountable as private bodies. Once we have our policies in place and perhaps they see the way that we operate, hopefully they can also just get on board and really just come to the party.
Because I think they have to. They're holding all of our information. We want them to be
we need
compliant.
to collaborate. This is always a balancing of interests and everything. So definitely.
Chanel, I just want to say a big thank you for coming in and chatting to us today, as well as for writing that article. I think it is an amazing article that we all need to be aware of. If anyone does want to read Chanel's article, it is available on the LabourNet blog, or I'm sure you can get hold of us at sesk@labournet.com. Thank you for joining us this week.
And that wraps up another show of Stuff Employees Should Know. If you've enjoyed today's show, please hit us up on social media, or if you just want to get in touch, send us an email at sesk@labournet.com. Let us know what topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes, or any feedback relative to the episode that you've listened to today or any of our previous episodes. So from myself, Yasser Yaslak, Ismail, Samantha, and Chanel, and unfortunately not BGD today. Until the next episode, cheers.
Stuff Employers Should Know was proudly brought to you by LabourNet, management's ultimate HR solution. For more episodes from Stuff Employers Should Know, go to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you play your favorite shows. Case law or statutes referenced in the podcast are current at the time of recording.